This lesson we're going to be looking at the heart, and the learning objective for today is simply to explore the structure and function of the heart. So we're going to break down the heart into certain sections and see how those sections actually manage the blood and how they pass the blood on. Now, there are certain labels of the heart that you will need to know, and we're just going to go through that now in terms of what you actually need to know, what your examiner is expecting for you to know. So we'll just do a quick recap of the blood vessels and the circulatory system, and I want you to answer a few questions for me on Teams. I'll pause the video when I want you to type back a question on Teams. So here we have the circulatory system that's being represented, and you see the heart beating and you see the lungs on the other side. Now if we go into one of the blood vessels, we can see the red blood cells which are transporting nutrients around the body and removing waste products. Here we can see oxygen binding to hemoglobin and being taken to the rest of the body. Now oxygenated blood flows in the arteries, and then we get to the capillaries where the oxygen is released to the respiring cells. At the same time, waste products such as carbon dioxide come into the capillaries and are taken up by blood plasma and the red blood cells. Then this goes back to, if we pause it here, it goes to we are going into the veins now, which are taking blood back to the heart. Now, could you tell me how one mechanism by which veins are able to help blood back to the heart? So the veins are represented here in blue. Could you tell me one mechanism that helps veins get blood back to the heart, deoxygenated blood back to the heart so it can be pumped to the lungs? One mechanism by which veins are adapted, we can say, or we can say talk about a mechanism that helps deoxygenated blood back to the heart. So you can see here the deoxygenated blood is going back to the heart, and here the deoxygenated blood will flow into the heart, and then it will be pumped to the lungs to get reoxygenated, or oxygen to be put into the red blood cells for it to the cycle to start again. So just to note, you can see that the veins are represented here, and the artery network is also represented. So I want you to tell me how are veins adapted, or what mechanisms help veins. So as you can see here, for your exam, you're expected to know certain structures and functions of blood vessels. So it says here, students should know the structure and functioning of the human heart and lungs, including how lungs are adapted for gaseous exchange. We are going to come across lungs and how the lungs work a bit later on, once we've completed the structure of the heart and the function of the heart. So with regards to the heart, you have to know that the heart is an organ that pumps blood around the body in a double circulatory system. Then we're going to have to know in detail about the right ventricle and the left ventricle, so the ventricles in total, and also about another structure of the heart known as atriums. And then we're going to have to also put together the blood vessels that connect the heart, lungs and the rest of the body. Now I want you to focus your attention on the third paragraph, where it talks about knowledge of the blood vessels associated with the heart. So there are a number of blood vessels associated with the heart, but for your exam you will need to know about the aorta, the vena cava, the pulmonary artery, the pulmonary vein and the coronary arteries. So be aware that when I show you the diagram of the heart, there will be certain diagrams that show more information than you need. However, your knowledge in terms of what you're expected to know and in terms of what you're expected to write, for example, for a 6-mark answer or 6-mark question, you need to be using the keywords that are listed here. So talking about these blood vessels. And notice it says knowledge of the heart valves is not required. So you don't. There are various valves, and they have different names in the heart, and in certain blood vessels. You do not need to know those names, but you do need to know the function of valves. And we've already come across valves when we were looking at the structure of veins, and they are similar. So now let us look at the structure of the heart and look at the various components. So I'm just going to label the sections that you will need to know and you will need to understand in terms of how the heart functions. So we're going to start with looking at the heart in terms of two sections. We've got the right hand side of the heart and we've got the left hand side of the heart. Now, the right hand side is associated with deoxygenated blood, and that is why it is shaded in blue. And the left hand side of the heart is associated with oxygenated blood, and that's why it is shaded in red. And notice the divider going down, splitting the heart in two. That divider stops oxygenated blood and deoxygenated blood from mixing. So this is important. So you have two chambers, two separate, two sides of the heart. Now, let's look at the various subsections in the heart that you will need to know. So let's deal with the right hand side first. So here we have the lowest part of the right hand side of the heart we call the right ventricle. Okay, so the lowest part of the heart on the right hand side is called the right ventricle, and that's that chamber here. That's where you can see it's separated from the uppermost chamber. Now the upper chamber on top of the right ventricle is known as the right atrium. So we say right atrium. We'll go on to the function of each section in a moment, but first I just want you to have an overview of the different sections. Then we have, next to the right atrium, you have a blood vessel. Now, the first arrow going here that you see just above the label right atrium, that is blood coming from the body. So this is blood coming from the body. Okay, so that arrow there represents blood coming from the body. And the blood vessel itself is called the vena cava, and it brings deoxygenated blood into the heart. So that vessel is known as the vena cava. Okay, and brings deoxygenated blood. Okay, brings deoxygenated blood into the heart. Now, the arrow coming in the opposite direction is blood coming from the head. So you've got blood coming from the body and coming from the head, and it's going into the right atrium via this blood vessel known as the vena cava, which is bringing all the deoxygenated blood from the rest of the body. So this is blood from the head. Now, moving towards the center, you've got the pulmonary artery. This takes deoxygenated blood to the lungs. So once the blood has come from the body and from the head and drained into the atrium, and then it passes from the atrium into the ventricle and then is pushed up. This section here is known as a pulmonary artery. And it takes deoxygenated blood to the lungs. Okay, now what's important here is, and it's important you don't mix this up with the terminology we looked at before in terms of artery and veins. Here you've got an artery that's carrying deoxygenated blood. And I want you to take particular note of this, because in our previous lesson we looked at how arteries were carrying oxygenated blood away from the body. Here you've got a label that's telling you it's an artery, but it's carrying deoxygenated blood. Now, the reason that we say it's an artery is because it is carrying blood away from the heart. Regardless of whether it's oxygenated or deoxygenated, it's carrying blood away from the heart to the lungs. Therefore, we call it an artery. But we have to be careful here and understand that it's deoxygenated blood. This deoxygenated blood is delivered to the lungs via the pulmonary artery for it to be oxygenated. Alright, now moving on. So now we're going to move to the left-hand side of the heart. And here you've got the aorta. And this carries oxygenated blood around the body. Now, what's important is aorta, because it's carrying blood away from the body, it's an artery. Now, based on what I just spoke about with the pulmonary artery, you should be able to understand why this is the pulmonary vein. Okay, and we'll say, so what I want you to do is pause the video here, and I want you to type back to me on Teams why this blood vessel here, which is draining blood into the left atrium, why it's called the pulmonary vein. So I want you to tell me this on Teams. Why is this blood vessel called the pulmonary vein? Okay, and to give you a clue, it's bringing blood from the lungs. It's bringing blood from the lungs, but why do we call it the pulmonary vein? Okay, so just pause the video and could you type back your answer back to me on Teams, and can you just label that question A, 1A, so I know which question it refers to. 1A, pulmonary vein, but why do we say it's a pulmonary vein? Could you type back your answer on Teams? Okay, moving down one, we have the left atrium. Notice we have a right atrium and we have a left atrium, and they are the uppermost chambers of the heart. Then we have these two arrows pointing towards valves, heart valves. Okay, and from our previous lesson, I want you now to type on Teams, and this is going to be question 1B, why we have valves in the heart. So what could be the reason that we have valves? So could you tell me why we have valves in each section? So why do we have a valve here, and why do we have a valve here? What could be the reason for having valves at those two sections? So this is, you might have to think about this. So this would be about 2 sentences, I would say, to tell me why we have valves at each point. Not why we have valves in general, but why could we have valves at each point on this diagram here? So could you pause the video and type back your answer or your suggestion as to why we have valves at those 2 points? Okay, now the lower part of the diagram now we have here is the left ventricle. Okay, so we have a right ventricle and we have a left ventricle. And lastly, the last box that we have, it's the arrows pointing towards the muscular heart wall. Okay, so this is the muscular heart wall. Now, this is thicker, as you can see. It's considerably thicker on the left-hand side in comparison to the right-hand side. If you look here, we can see that the thickness is comparable. Now, there is a significant difference there. Now, this is because the left-hand side of the heart needs to pump blood to the rest of the body, whereas the right-hand side of the heart is pumping blood to the lungs. And just by geographical location on your body, you can know that the lungs are closer to your heart than, let's say, the calf muscles in your leg. So the left-hand side of the heart needs to be pumping blood a greater distance than the right-hand side. Therefore, the left-hand side of the heart is thicker, has a the left-hand side muscle is significantly thicker. So what I want you to do is, you don't need to draw this diagram out, but I want you to take a note or just study this diagram now, see the various sections of the heart, the names, and then we're going to move on now and look at another section of the heart, and we'll come back. So, as we just discussed, the left-hand side of the heart is significantly bigger than the right-hand side, specifically the muscular heart wall. Now, the walls of the heart are constructed of muscle, and this is a special type of muscle, and it is known as cardiac muscle. This muscle is supplied with oxygen by the coronary arteries. Now, why this is important is because the heart muscles are continuously beating. They need a lot of oxygen, and because they're continuously working, they're continuously respiring. So they have a special set of blood vessels known as the coronary arteries that supply this oxygen to the heart muscle. Now, when these coronary arteries do not provide sufficient oxygenated blood to the heart muscle, this is where people get into certain difficulties. So let's take a look at the coronary arteries and their positioning on the heart, because it wasn't on the previous diagram. So if you look here, you can see the coronary arteries represented in the diagrams here. Now, these blood vessels, which are shown here, it's a bit clearer here. If you look here and here, these are your coronary arteries. The muscles of the heart are constantly working, so they need a large blood supply, good blood supply of oxygen and glucose. And this is supplied by the blood in the coronary arteries. Now, because your heart is constantly beating, it's constantly working, the cells in these heart muscles are constantly respiring, and therefore they need a good supply of oxygen and glucose. And your heart muscle never rests. It doesn't stop, and it doesn't take a day off or take a holiday, because if it did do that, then it would be almost like an indefinite holiday, if you know what I mean, because the heart is vital because it pumps oxygenated blood around the body, and without oxygenated blood, the rest of your body cells which are respiring would die very quickly. So the heart needs to be beating, but the heart itself is also a muscle that has respiring cells, so it needs a good supply of oxygen and glucose, and it's supplied by these blood vessels known as the coronary arteries. Any problem in these arteries will result in certain heart problems, such as heart failure, which we're going to look at. We're going to look at problems associated with any blockages in the coronary arteries and possible solutions. But for now, I just want you to know the name of the arteries that supply the heart muscles with oxygenated blood, and also their location, how they would appear on a diagram. So if you were ever asked to identify the coronary arteries, notice these are where they appear and how they appear, so then you would be able to identify them correctly. Now we're just going to have a quick look at the beating of the heart. And as I said, the beating of the heart is brought about by specialized muscles known as the cardiac muscles. So if I play this video here, you can see how the heart is beating, and you can see a section of this cardiac muscle has been taken out. And This section of the cardiac muscle can be segregated into three sections. This is the epicardium, the outermost layer of the heart that covers the heart. And then we move on to the inner section, and this is called the myocardium. And you can see here, this is the heart muscle. So the myocardium is the heart muscle that is continuously beating, and this is the waves of contraction happened through this myocardium, which is made up of cardiac muscle, which is striated muscle. Then we come to the inner section of the heart, and this is the endocardium, and this is the inner lining of the heart. Now, you do not need to know these names in detail. However, you do need to know that the heart muscle is cardiac muscle and it has striated muscle inside. So now we're just going to put a few notes down for the structure of the heart and how it actually beats. So can you take down this point here? Heart pumps blood to your lungs and your body. So the heart is pumping blood to your lungs and to your body. So that's the primary function. Now there are two sides of the heart that fill and empty at the same time. So in the simulations you were able to see how there were ventricles and atriums and how they were filling and emptying with blood, and also how there's a left and right hand side. So the two sides of the heart fill and empty at the same time, and the heartbeat is coordinated. Okay, so the way it contracts and relaxes, there's a coordinated manner in which this happens, and the two sides of the heart are filling and emptying at the same time. The third point is that blood enters the top chambers of the heart, which are called atria or atrium. So now we've just looked at the atrium, and we're just going to see that on a diagram again, and you've seen it via the simulation, the top chambers of the heart. So now let us look at the heart and how it beats in this simulation. So as you can see this whole, you can see part of the circulatory system here with deoxygenated blood and oxygenated blood. You can see the coronary arteries on the heart as well. Now we're going to just look at how the heart actually beats and how the blood is moved in and out of the heart. So if we look here, we can see this is the heartbeat. So you can see how the heart is beating. And notice also here that there is some fat surrounding the heart as well, and this is important. This is not unhealthy. This is part of a healthy heart, where you see that fat on the outside of the heart. And you can also notice the coronary arteries here as well, supplying the heart muscle with glucose and oxygen. And deoxygenated blood is in blue and the oxygenated blood is in red. So as we see here, you can see the shape of the heart as well, and the typical shape of the heart. And as we go into the heart, you can see the movement of the ventricles and the atriums. And if we go back a little bit here, so you can see here the movement of the ventricles and the atrium. So as the ventricles contract, and then you can also see the valves connecting the atrium and the ventricles also respond accordingly. So you can see this is the heartbeat, but as the heart beats, notice how the ventricles are reacting and also how the valves are reacting. Also, I want you to notice the thickness of the ventricle walls on the left-hand side of the heart compared to the right-hand side of the heart. Notice the cardiac muscle is much thicker on the left-hand side than the right-hand side, because the left-hand side has to pump blood to the rest of the body. Now we'll just look at when blood is flowing into the heart, what you will see is the deoxygenated blood coming in via the right atrium and into the left ventricle, and notice where it goes. So if we play that again, Look carefully at the valves, how they open and close in response to the contraction. So with this, you can see how the heartbeat is coordinated, and this is just the outer covering of the heart that was represented there. Here you can see where the atriums are, represented the top chambers of the heart. Now moving down, the blood coming, so if we just look at how the blood fills the right atrium, the blood coming into the right atrium from the vena cava is deoxygenated blood from your body. So can you take this point down? The blood coming into the right atrium from the vena cava is deoxygenated blood from your body. It's coming via the veins, which are bringing deoxygenated blood from the rest of the body back to your heart, which your heart will then pump to the lungs to be oxygenated again. Now, staying with the atriums, so we've looked at the right atrium. Now, the left atrium, the blood coming into the left atrium is the pulmonary vein, is via the pulmonary vein, and it is oxygenated blood from the lungs. So the blood coming into the left atrium is via the pulmonary vein, and it is oxygenated blood, and it's coming from the lungs. So that's the left ventricle. Can you take that down, please? Blood coming into the left atrium should be via the pulmonary vein, and it is oxygenated blood from the lungs. So the next point for the atriums is that the atria contract together, and this forces blood down into the ventricles, and there are valves, the valves in the heart and in the blood vessels themselves close to stop the blood flowing backwards back out of the heart. So the atria contract together, right and left, and this forces the blood into the ventricles. The valves close to stop the blood flowing backwards out of the heart. Can you take this point down, please? So this simulation shows quite nicely how the heart beats, and in terms of the electrical conduction that causes the heartbeat. You do not need to know this for your exam. However, by looking at this, you can appreciate how the heart is contracting and relaxing and how the ventricles are filling. Notice where the electrical impulses are coming from as the heart beats. Notice how the blood fills the ventricles and how the valves are responding in response to the contraction. So you can see here that the electrical impulses are sent from a specific region in the heart, and they are not coming from any other part of the central nervous system. They are coming from a specific region within the heart structure, and this is causing the heart to beat. And these electrical impulses are traveling across these regions of the heart you can see here. So we have just seen how the heart contracts and relaxes via electrical impulses that travel through the cardiac muscle, through the striated cardiac muscle. Now, a combination of inputs will cause the heart to beat. There are electrical impulses that are coming from the brain as well, and also chemical messengers that are also arriving at the heart and causing the heart to contract. And here you can see those messengers arriving at the heart here, causing the contraction. And it's via the autonomic nervous system that we get the heartbeat that we are seeing here. Looking at the ventricles, you can see here from the diagram, to remind you where the ventricles are located, the ventricles contract and force blood out of the heart. So when the right and left ventricles contract, they are forcing blood out of the heart. The right ventricles force deoxygenated blood to the lungs in the pulmonary artery. I'll repeat again. The right ventricles are forcing deoxygenated blood to the lungs via the pulmonary artery. The left ventricle pumps oxygenated blood around via a large artery called the aorta. Now the aorta is going to be supplying blood to the rest of the body, and it is under high pressure as well. And this high pressure is brought about via the thickness of the left ventricle, which is considerably more than the left ventricle. The left ventricle is considerably thicker than the right ventricle, and this brings about the high pressure in the aorta. So I'll repeat again. The left ventricle has considerably thicker muscle or more cardiac muscle than the right ventricle, because the left ventricle has to pump blood at high pressure so it will be supplied to the rest of the body. Here we are looking at the heart valves. Now, as the blood is pumped into the pulmonary artery and the aorta, valves close to prevent backward flow of blood. So you can see the pulmonary artery and the aorta on the top diagram, and they are known as the aortic and pulmonary semilunar valves. Then we have the tricuspid and mitral valves, which are dealing with the blood that is flowing into the ventricles. Now, these four valves are responsible for preventing backward flow of blood. Now, looking at this simulation, you can see how these valves are working and how they're working together to prevent the backward flow of blood as the heart is contracting and relaxing. So let us look at how the valves are working together in a coordinated manner to prevent backward flow. So you can see the tricuspid and mitral valves, which are opening and closing, and they are working in a coordinated way as the blood enters the ventricles from the atriums, and then blood is going through the aortic and pulmonary semilunar valves, and this is where again they are opening and closing to prevent backward flow into the heart. So if we just go again, you can see the motion of these valves and how they work in coordination to prevent backward flow of blood. So here is a summary of what we have just covered. The heart has 4 chambers. Ventricles pump blood out of the heart. Blood comes from the veins into the atria through the valves to the ventricles. Then blood leaves via the arteries. So this is just a quick summary of what we have just been looking at. Now, we'll look at this the final simulation here for the coordination of the heart beating, and you can just appreciate how the blood is flowing into the heart and leaving the heart. So as a quick summary, we'll just see how deoxygenated blood and oxygenated blood are flowing into the heart and flowing out. Okay, so let's see. Here you can see both oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. Now, what we've just seen here is the atrium. So the sections highlighted in blue are the atriums. Now, we have deoxygenated blood flowing from the atriums into the ventricles. So you can see here, if we go back, see the 2 arrows that are flowing? This is deoxygenated blood. If you remember back to our first diagram where this was identified, the 2 arrows here represent deoxygenated blood flowing to the right atrium. Now blood then flows from the atrium into the ventricle. So if you just see here again, blood is flowing from the right atrium through the valves into the left ventricle, and this is now the left ventricle is full. This contracts and the blood is sent from the left ventricle to the pulmonary artery that takes the deoxygenated blood to the lungs. So you can see here that the deoxygenated blood is going to the lungs via the pulmonary artery. Now, once the blood has picked up oxygen, it will come back to the heart. You see here, it's coming back via the left atrium, what's highlighted in blue, and it's flowing into the left ventricle. And here, the blood fills the left ventricle and is pumped into the aorta to be passed around the rest of the body. These task questions I want you to answer on teams. I'll put a label on these diagrams with a corresponding number or letter, and I want you to answer with the corresponding number or letter on teams that refers to the label. For example, this one we will say, not that one, sorry, not that one, do it this way. Okay, here, we'll say this is 4B. Okay, 4B, what is 4B? Okay, next one. We'll call this 5C. And last one on this diagram, we will have, let's say here, 2C. Okay, so each letter, number and letter, could you give it a corresponding correct label and give your answer on teams? Diagram, I want you to identify this region, and we'll call this 1C, and this region, or this structure here, we will say 5, let's just say 5E, and finally one more on this diagram. Let's take this structure here. What is this structure here? And we'll say this is 1F. Okay, so can you identify these structures and can you put the corresponding number and letter on teams? In this diagram, I would like you to identify this structure. I would like you to label that one, say 3G. And this structure here, and we'll label this 2T. And then finally, this structure here, so whatever these two arrows seem to be pointing to, and I want you to tell me what type of tissue are these two arrow labels pointing to. These two lines, what type of tissue are they pointing to? And we'll call that 8A. Okay, so for each corresponding number and letter, can you give me the correct label on teams? And I'll repeat, 8A, I'm asking for what type of tissue is it? And can you type your answer on teams?